night or whatever time you're watching this. We're going to be learning about simplifying imaginary numbers today. But first, what are imaginary numbers and why are they imaginary and why do we need them? Well, when you do the square root of a negative number, let's do an example problem here. Square root of negative 169. Well, we know that the square root of 169 is 13, but we have this negative here, so you can't really do that. So if we take out this 169, then you end up with 13, but you end up with the square root of negative 1. That's not a thing. You can't do a square root of negative 1, but if that were possible, you could still do math with it and figure out some cool graphs and work with numbers that don't exist. So that's where the imaginary numbers come into play. I is the symbol for an imaginary number. Let's write that a little bit lower. I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So when we carry that back to our problem here, the square root of negative 1 is I. So the answer to this would just be 13I. So you have to keep in mind the value of I and what that means. The square root of negative 1 is the value of I. You have to keep that in mind, especially when multiplying or squaring or raising I to any power. But when you're adding or subtracting, it's not really as important, and you can just treat it as a variable. So let's try some simplification problems. If you have 3I squared, well, you have to distribute that squared, so that's 3 squared times I squared. 3 squared is 9, so 9 times, well, what's I? I is square root of negative 1 squared. The square root and the square cancel out, so then this is just equal to 9 times negative 1. And 9 times negative 1 is negative 9. So that's 1. Let's try another a little bit backwards. When you have the square root of negative 16, that's the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times 16. So square root of negative 1, when you take that out, you get I, square root of 16. Square root of 16 is 4, so you get 4I. Let me box in these answers so you can see them here. What if the negative is outside and inside of the square root? Do they cancel out and make positive? No, because you have the square root in the way, so all this outside negative does is make the given answer negative. So you keep that negative on the outside. Square root of negative 144 is the negative square root of negative 1 times 144. And then you have that negative 1, so it's negative square root, that negative 1 comes out as I, because that's the square root of negative 1, times the square root of 144. Well, the square root of 144 is 12, so negative 12I. Well, what if the inside square root isn't possible? What if you can't take it out and simplify it? That doesn't really make much of a change. All you're doing is treating the I as a variable. So if you have negative square root of negative 7, then that's the same thing as negative square root of negative 1 times 7. So you have negative I square root of 7. Now you can't take out or simplify this negative or the square root of 7, but you don't really need to because you're just treating it as a variable. It doesn't actually change any properties of your math. So that would just be your final answer. That's pretty much it. All you have to do is remember that the value of I is the square root of negative 1, but you don't need to use it in scenarios where it just stays as a variable. But remembering that value is very helpful when you're dealing with solutions to problems, especially in Pythagorean equations or quadratic equations. When you plug them into your calculator, you get an error because the number doesn't exist, but you can get an imaginary number when you solve it out by hand. But that's it.